Good afternoon, Your Honors. This is case number IT 9833T, Prosecutor versus Radislav Krstic.
L'accusation. May we have the appearances for the prosecution, please?
Good afternoon, Mr. President and Your Honors, counsel for the defense. My name is Mark Harmon. Present with me are my co-counsel, Mr. Peter McCloskey, to my immediate right, to his right, Mr. Andrew Cayley, and to his right, Ms. Magda Karagiannakis. Present also with me are my two prosecution assistants, to the far right, Ms. Janet Stewart, and to my left, Ms. Kirsten Keith.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Mr. Harmon. Appearances for the defense, please.
Dobar dan, časni sud.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Good afternoon, prosecutors. I'm Nenad Petrušić, defense counsel. My co-counsel with me here today, as well as during these proceedings, was Mr. Višnjić and also our associate, Mr. Radosavljević.
Good afternoon, General Krstić. May justice be done, lest the world perish, said Hegel. The trial chamber is doing its duty in meting out justice today, and in this way hopes to have contributed to creating a better world. The trial chamber is rendering its judgment today in the prosecutor's case against General Krstić, who stands accused of genocide or complicity to commit genocide, persecution, extermination, murder, and forced transfer or deportation, and of crimes committed between July and November 1995, following the attack of the Serbian forces on the town of Srebrenica. At the time the attack was launched, General Krstić was the deputy commander of the Drina Corps, one of the corps which constitute the Army of Republika Srpska, often known as the VRS. The exact date General Krstić became the Drina Corps commander has been the subject of professional, courteous, but at times particularly acrimonious debates between the parties. I will return to this point. I wish to make several preliminary comments. First, I wish to point out that throughout the trial, the debates proceeded smoothly and the parties conducted themselves in an exemplary manner. In this case, both the prosecution and defense demonstrated in the most striking fashion that cooperation and confrontation need not be mutually exclusive. The arguments were always correct and, in particular, were of the highest quality. The final arguments were presentations of excellent legal and factual summaries of the respective positions of the prosecution and the defense. I wish to extend my appreciation to all counsel and their teams for the work they have done and the atmosphere in which it was carried out. I wish to pay tribute to the work of the Office of the Prosecutor in the broadest sense, and in particular to Mr. General Radislav, the former team leader in the Office of the Prosecutor. I also have in mind everyone working for the prosecution and for the defense who traveled on site, the experts and their assistants, the investigators, technicians, soldiers, security officers, and all those who saw, smelled, touched, exhumed, washed, autopsied, and analyzed. It is not difficult to imagine how much patience, perseverance, and devotion was required to perform this thankless but indispensable task. I also wish to thank everyone who offered us their unstinting assistance, frequently well after normal working hours. I also wish to thank the staff of the detention unit and the Serbian and Dutch physicians and surgeons who shared their experience with us so that the accused would receive the treatment required for his medical condition. Lastly, I wish to underscore the work of the military analysts and experts, Mr. Richard Butler and General Dunnett for the prosecutor, and General Radislav for the defense. All this work made it possible to hear 128 witnesses, 2 of whom were called by the trial chamber. In all, more than 1,100 exhibits, some several hundred pages long, were admitted during the proceedings. I will move quickly over the details of the proceedings, which appear in the annex to the judgment. I will note only that because of General Krstić's medical condition, the trial was interrupted for several weeks at the start of the year. Nonetheless, as you know, the trial chamber's work did not stop since it was hearing 2 cases at the same time. I now come to the reason for this hearing, pronouncing of the judgment in the case the prosecutor against Radislav Krstic. I do not intend to read out the entire written judgment, but to present a summary thereof, so that you, General Krstić, and the public will know essentially the reasons why the trial chamber reached the conclusions it has reached. I wish to point out that the only authoritative text is the written judgment, which will be available at the end of this hearing, and nothing I am going to say can be seen as modifying that judgment in any way. General Krstić, the crimes of which you stand accused are based on the events which occurred following the attack of the Serbian forces on the town of Srebrenica in July 1995. Srebrenica, the name of a town which has become synonymous with the conflict which devastated the former Yugoslavia. It is a name which immediately calls to mind thousands of people subjected to siege, famine, and deprivation of everything, even water and time to breathe. The name of an enclave which the United Nations declared a safe area and which fell almost without a shot being fired. Srebrenica, a name which conjures up images one would prefer not to see: women, children, old people, forced to climb into buses, leaving for destinations unknown. Men separated from their families, stripped of their belongings, men fleeing, men taken prisoner, men never to be seen again, men who would be found, but not always, dead, corpses piled up in mass graves, corpses with their hands tied, corpses with their eyes blindfolded frequently, dismembered corpses as well, identified corpses. Srebrenica is also a name for a post-traumatic syndrome. The syndrome displayed by the women, children, and old people who did not die, and who, ever since July 1995, 6 years now, still have no news of their husbands and sons, fathers, brothers, uncles, grandfathers. Thousands of amputated lives 6 years later, robbed of the affection and love of their kin, now reduced to ghosts who return to haunt them day after day, night after night. The trial chamber was presented with a great deal of evidence, which could be called impressive. Because of the violence of the crimes, the almost unbearable images put before it, and the pain to which the victims gave voice in their testimony, the trial chamber needed to be particularly vigilant so that it could take the necessary distance for carrying out its work of justice with the requisite calm and as objectively as possible. During its meticulous analysis of, inter alia, all the evidence, testimony, exhibits, it was especially attentive to the need to ensure that the evidence it had made it possible to verify whether crimes had been committed. It carried out a scrupulous examination of all these in order to decide on which or any of the criminal characterizations the prosecutor set out in her indictment a conviction could be entered. Lastly, and above all, the trial chamber carefully weighed whether one or several of the crimes could be ascribed to General Krstić. Essentially, the trial chamber is responding to three questions. What are the facts? What are the crimes that were committed? And can General Krstić be held responsible for any of these crimes? I will now present a summary of the conclusions the trial chamber reached in respect of these three questions.
What are the facts? Transfer of women, children, and old people. The attack of the Serbian forces on the Srebrenica enclave followed several months, actually several years of confrontation. Srebrenica is located in a part of eastern Bosnia, central Podrinje, which was of particular interest to both parties involved. To the Bosnian Muslims, because the town was predominantly Muslim before the conflict, because it is located between Tuzla to the north and Žepa to the south, both of which were under Muslim control, because the fall of Srebrenica could have extremely negative consequences for Sarajevo, which was under siege at the time. To the Bosnian Serbs, because the region known as Central Podrinje was in that part of Bosnia that borders Serbia, and because it was important to establish the continuity of the territories under Serbian control in Bosnia like in neighboring Serbia. And of course, for the opposite reasons of those of the Bosnian Muslims. In 1992 and 1993, there were many clashes between the Serbs and the Bosnian Muslims for control of the region. After several successful operations, the ABAIH, the Bosnian Muslim Army, was confronted with a counter-offensive mounted by the VRS, the Bosnian Serb Army, which finally reduced the enclave to about 150 square kilometers. In March 1993, siege was laid to Srebrenica, and part of the population was transferred. On the 16th of April 1993, the United Nations Security Council declared Srebrenica a safe area, and an agreement signed by the parties turned it into a demilitarized zone, to which an UNPROFOR contingent was dispatched. However, the parties did not agree on the definition and interpretation of the notion of demilitarized zone. In particular, the Bosnian Muslims considered that only the town of Srebrenica itself was demilitarized, and that the ABIH sent weapons and munitions to the enclave. Still, the situation remained relatively stable until January 1995, when the Bosnian Serbs adopted a more hardline position, in particular in respect of the supply of humanitarian aid. On the 8th of March 1995, the president of the Bosnian Serbs, Radovan Karadzic, issued the order which is known under the name of Directive 7, which was to separate the enclaves of Srebrenica and Žepa. In respect of what concerned the Drina Corps in particular, President Karadzic wrote this: by well thought out combat operations, create an unbearable situation of total insecurity, with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica and Žepa. On the basis of this directive, on the 31st of March 1995, General Ratko Mladic also issued a directive, which he sent inter alia to the Drina Corps. The directive organized a large-scale attack known as Zadejstvo 95, whose objective was, I quote, to defend the territory of Republika Srpska on all fronts, and in particular to avoid, and I quote again, at any cost, the lifting of the siege of Sarajevo. General Mladic foresaw that whatever the result of the events and the escalation of the conflict, UNPROFOR land forces and NATO forces would probably not be engaged, except in those cases when they come under direct physical threat. During the operation, he said, the forces of the Republika Srpska army would collaborate in strategic camouflage and improvement of the tactical position by carrying out, among others, active combat operations around the Srebrenica, Žepa, and Gorazde enclaves. In the spring of 1995, the situation in Sarajevo deteriorated significantly. Humanitarian convoys were obstructed and sometimes blocked. Even the Dutch UNPROFOR contingent could not effect its normal troop rotation. Some of the observation posts reported a significant reinforcement of the nearby Serbian positions. The humanitarian situation became catastrophic. The 28th ABI-8 Division, that is the Bosnian Muslim Army in the Srebrenica enclave, asked that the blockade be lifted. Harassment operations were launched against the Serbian positions. This is known as Operation Skakavac, and apparently crimes were committed in particular in the Serbian village of Višnjica on the 26th of June 1995. At the same time, the Bosnian Serb army was on the move. On the 31st of May 1995, it captured one of the UNPROFOR observation posts. On the 2nd of July 1995, the Drina Corps commander, General Jovanovic, signed the orders for a planned attack on Srebrenica. On the 6th of July, the attack was launched from south of the enclave. Thousands of Bosnian Muslims fled to the town. The Bosnian Serb forces encountered no resistance. On the 9th of July, President Krstić decided that under the prevailing conditions, the town was to be taken. On the 10th of July, the panicked Bosnian Muslim population began to flee towards the United Nations facilities in the town, Bravo Company, or out of the town towards the north on the Bratunac road to Potocari. The commander of the Dutch battalion, which is often called Dutch Bat, asked for air support, but he did not receive it. On the 11th of July, General Mladic, Chief of Staff of the Bosnian Serb Army, along with General Jovanovic, General Krstić, and many other VRS officers, made a triumphant entry into a Srebrenica deserted by its inhabitants. By the evening of the 11th of July, Srebrenica was a dead town in the hands of the Bosnian Serb forces. The inhabitants of Srebrenica and the refugees there fled en masse to the United Nations base in Potocari. The Bosnian Serb forces would soon learn that there were, in fact, very few men in the milling crowd gathering around the UNPROFOR camp. In Potocari, there were mostly women, children, and old people. There were very few men in Potocari, because even though one cannot know for sure who gave the orders or organized the departures, the men took a different route, whether they were members of the 28th Division or not. They assembled in the little villages of Jaglici and Šušnjari, northwest of Srebrenica, and they decided to flee through the woods towards Tuzla, which is much further to the north, in a territory which is under Bosnian Muslim control. About 10 to 15,000 men thus formed a column several kilometers long, and they left on foot through the woods. However, General Mladic did not yet know that when, on the 11th of July, he called the Dutch Bad commander, Colonel Karmans, to a meeting at the Hotel Fontana in Bratunac. Along with General Mladic, there were many VRS officers, including General Jovanovic, but not General Krstić. At 20 hours on the 11th of July, General Mladic asked Colonel Karmans whether UNPROFOR could organize the transport of the population. He also asked him to return with a representative of the population of Srebrenica. The second meeting was held in the same hotel on that same day. It was then about 23 hours. General Mladic was in attendance with General Krstić, but without General Jovanovic. Colonel Karmans came with a teacher, Mr. Manjic, who represented the population. This time, General Mladic's tone and attitude were much harder. Through the open window came the sounds of a pig being slaughtered. General Mladic had the signboard of the Srebrenica town hall, which had been removed from the building, placed on the table. The Dutch bad commander said that there were about 15 to 20,000 refugees and that the humanitarian situation was distressing. Mr. Mandic tries to explain that he has no power to do anything. The answer fell, and it was a final one. That's your problem. Bring in the people who can ensure that the weapons are laid down and save your people from destruction. Another meeting was scheduled for the following day. It began around 10 o'clock on the 12th of July. General Mladic was still there, with General Krstić beside him. Colonel Popovich, to whom we will return later, was also there. The Dutch bad representatives returned with Mr. Mandic and two other civilian representatives, Mrs. Omanovic, an economist, and Mr. Nuhanovic, a businessman. General Mladic again insisted that the condition for the survival of the Bosnian Muslims of Srebrenica was that they lay down their weapons. He said that he would supply the buses to transport the population, but that the fuel would have to be provided by UNPROFOR. Everyone understood that the Bosnian Muslims were to leave the enclave. Last, General Mladic said that all the men in Potocari would be separated in order to identify any possible war criminals. At around noon on the 12th of July, General Krstić gave a filmed interview to a journalist from Serbia. This took place right next to the United Nations base in Potocari. Behind him, passing trucks could be seen, buses as well. These were the buses the women, the children, and the old people would get into. The video the journalist made shows resigned people. The men are being separated from the women. Here and there one sees bags, bundles, a few belongings. Further away, a larger pile. The trial chamber would learn that these were the belongings of the men who had come to seek refuge in Potocari and who had been ordered to leave them there. The trial chamber knows that the belongings were subsequently burned by the Serbian forces. How did the situation appear to the Bosnian Muslims who'd sought refuge in Potocari? It was extremely serious. One needs to remember the shelling, including the shelling of the United Nations base in Srebrenica. One needs to imagine thousands of people crowded into a few buildings without water or food, other than a few pieces of candy thrown in by General Mladic in front of the cameras, and we were told, taken back as soon as the cameras had left. One must imagine the heat. One must picture the dozens of soldiers and Serbian armed men coming and going, shouting out discriminatory insults One must see the houses set on fire, the night falling, and the rising screams. The witnesses described to the trial chamber the prevailing atmosphere of terror, the rapes, the murders, the mistreatment, so pervasive that some of the refugees committed suicide or attempted to do so. In the evening of the 13th of July, all the women, all the children, all the old people were transferred. The trial chamber concludes that for legal reasons, which it sets out in its judgment, there was no expulsion. There was, however, a forced transfer of the women, children, and old people of Srebrenica. As to the men, they were systematically separated. They were forced to leave behind their meager possessions, leave behind even their identity papers. They were taken to a White House several meters from the United Nations base. They were beaten. Some were taken behind a house and killed. The survivors were taken away to various detention locations on the 13th of July, including to Bratunac. Those who were able to get on the buses were stopped right before leaving the territory under VRS control and driven to other detention locations by bus, school, hangar. During that time, the column, with most of the 28th Division Armed Forces at the head, tried to go through the forest and cross the east-west Bratunac Konjevic-Polje road. There were about 10 to 15,000 men in the column. About one-third was able to get through, including 3,000 men from the 28th Division. The first of these arrived on the 16th of July in Bosnian Muslim-controlled territory. As to the others, subjected to shelling and automatic weapon fire, they were captured or surrendered, sometimes to the so-called UNPROFOR soldiers, who were in fact none other than members of the Serbian forces using equipment stolen from Dutch banks. Some of these were killed immediately. Most were taken to collection centers, like a meadow in Sandici or a football field in Nova Kosaba. A last group would be luckier, because when they came into contact with the Serbian forces, negotiations were initiated and they would finally be able to go to territory under Bosnian Muslim control. In all, 7,000 to 8,000 men were captured, and almost all were killed by the Serbian forces. Only a few of them survived, some of whom came to testify before the trial chamber and described the horror of the mass executions, which they miraculously escaped. The mass executions began on the 13th of July. Some of the executions involved only a few individuals, like the one in Jadar on the morning of the 13th of July. In the afternoon of the 13th of July, there was another execution at a relatively isolated place, the Cherska Valley. 150 bodies would be exhumed there, and 50 metal ties would be found, some of them still wrapped around the victims' wrists. Late in the afternoon, the Serbian forces indulged in a real killing spree. A large number of Bosnian Muslims, 1,000 to 1,500 of them, approximately, were assembled in a warehouse in Krstić. The soldiers opened fire and lobbed in grenades. Those who tried to escape were killed on the spot. The next day, the Serbian forces called out to any survivors. Some of those who responded were forced to sing Serbian songs, and they were then executed. A large machine came to carry away the bodies and, in so doing, ripped off part of the warehouse for door frame. The experts would find traces of hair, blood, and human tissue on the floor and walls. On the 13th and the 14th of July, there were executions in Krstić also, that is, the place where the buses were to stop, so that the Serbian forces could verify whether there were still men on board, and if so, to force them to get off. They were then taken to a school, and after their hands were tied, they were taken to a field where they were executed. On the 14th of July, 1,000 Bosnian Muslim men were assembled in the Grbavci school in Horahovac, in the gymnasium. Their eyes were blindfolded, and they were taken by truck to a field where they were executed. Machines were already digging up the ground before the executions had been completed. There were other executions from the 14th to the 16th of July. A group of 1,500 to 2,000 Bosnian Muslims was being detained at the Petkovci school. They were taken to an execution site next to an artificial lake, the Petkovci Dam. Their hands were tied and they were barefoot. They were executed with automatic weapons. This would also be the fate of 1,000 to 1,200 men at the Branjevo military farm. The trial chamber heard the testimony of a former VRS soldier, convicted by the tribunal for his participation in that execution. This is Mr. Dražen Ademović. The Bosnian Muslim men were brought in by the truck, many with their hands tied, some wearing blindfolds. All but one were dressed in civilian clothing. The execution squad fired over and over again until, as Mr. Ademović said, their fingers hurt. Immediately afterwards, the soldiers went to Pilica. In the village, there is a cultural center, the Pilica Dom. That's where several hundred Bosnian Muslim men were locked up. Mr. Ademović and several others refused to participate any further in the executions and sat down in a cafe across from the cultural center, from where they could hear the shots and the explosions. There would be no survivors. When the investigators first opened the door to the cultural center, they discovered clear traces of the massacre and the conditions in which the massacre was perpetrated. Bullet marks, traces of explosives, blood stains, bits of human remains everywhere, high up on the walls and even under the stage of the theater. And one single forgotten identity document that belonged to a Bosnian Muslim. The cultural center is located on the side of the main road, crossing the village at the point where buses stop. In front of the cultural center today stands a memorial in honor of the Serbian heroes who died for the Serbian cause. There were other executions as well, in particular in Kozluk and Nezuk. The last mass execution appears to have been on the 19th of July 1995. In all, the experts estimate that between 7,000 and 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men were executed between the 13th and the 19th of July 1995. Despite the efforts which have been made, very few mortal remains have been found. Why? Because measures were taken in the fall of 1995 in order to attempt to cover up the scale of the crimes. The proof of what happened can be seen in particular in the aerial photographs provided to the prosecutor. These photographs made it possible to identify a number of mass grave sites at the time the executions were carried out. And also to note that other sites appeared after September 1995. The work of the experts has also made it possible to confirm the data by comparing the older mass graves with the more recent ones, since the latter are always located in regions with even more difficult access than those of the first group. No particular care was taken when the bodies were moved, and it has not been uncommon to find bodies with missing limbs. There can therefore be no doubt about the deliberate desire to conceal the existence of mass graves, and therefore the mass executions of civilians or persons no longer fit for combat.
Which are the crimes that were committed and that were retained by the chamber? This is the response to the second question. The prosecutor has characterized all the crimes and has charged General Krstić with genocide or complicity therein, persecution by means of murder, cruel treatment, acts of terror, destruction of personal property, and forced transfer. Extermination, murders within the meaning of Article 5 of the statute, murders within the meaning of Article 3 of the statute, deportation, or the inhumane act of forced transfer. In its judgment, the trial chamber responds to all these points and concludes by applying the case law of the appeals chamber in respect of cumulative charges. It is clear that the principal question which arose was whether genocide was committed against, in the prosecutor's words, a part of the Bosnian Muslim people as a national, ethnical, or religious group. The very notion of genocide is a recent one. It appeared for the first time in the Second World War and was codified in December 1948 in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which came into force on the 12th of January, 1951. Article 4 of the Statute of the Tribal Genocide repeats the definition of the Convention word for word. I quote, "Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such." Among the acts of genocide are killing members of the group and causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. There is little case law on genocide. While the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda has rendered several decisions on this point, the case law of our tribunal on the subject is almost non-existent. In this case, the fact that serious bodily or mental harm was inflicted on the Bosnian Muslims, or that they were murdered, has not been disputed. The trial chamber considers that one also cannot dispute the fact that the victims were chosen because of their membership in a national group, that is, precisely because they were Bosnian Muslims. However, can one claim that there was a will or intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a group as such protected by the Convention? The defense submitted that there was not, and expressed this opinion exhaustively and most clearly, both in its written submissions and final arguments. I will present a very brief and therefore incomplete summary of its arguments. The defense does not dispute the fact that the Serbian forces attacked Srebrenica's Bosnian Muslim population of fighting age. It claims, however, that precisely for this reason, one cannot speak of genocide, despite the scale of the murders committed. The defense first points out that the women, children, and old people were transferred and not killed. It goes on to state that a part of the column, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, was able to pass into territory under Bosnian Muslim control after negotiations had taken place. According to the defense, it cannot even be claimed that all the Bosnian Muslim men of fighting age were targeted. Lastly, and in any case, the defense sets out that the intent to destroy all the Bosnian Muslim men of fighting age cannot be interpreted as the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a group as such within the meaning of Article 4 of the Statute of the Tribunal. The trial chamber does not share this view. The trial chamber observes that although Bosnian Muslim men from Srebrenica were able to escape the hands of the Serbian forces after the fall of the enclave, this was due to chance or to the Serbian forces' inability to prevent the passage of the end of the column into territory under Bosnian Muslim control, given the operations in which it was engaged elsewhere. In other words, the Serbian forces really had no other choice at the time than to allow the rest of the column to pass. Subject only to the reservation which we have just stated, the executions were carried out on such a mass scale that the men from Srebrenica of fighting age were annihilated. The trial chamber points out that the decision to kill all the Bosnian Muslim men of fighting age was taken after the decision to transfer the women, children, and old people. For this reason, the Serbian forces had to realize the impact such a decision would have on the survival of the group. The trial chamber is not stating, nor does it wish to suggest, that a plan to commit genocide existed prior to the attack on Srebrenica, or even right before the city fell. However, according to the appeals chamber's decision in the Judgement case, a plan of genocide need not have been formed. Nor is it indispensable that, should such a plan exist, some time must pass between its conception and its implementation. What we are asserting here, on the basis of all the evidence presented to us, is that a decision was first taken to carry out ethnic cleansing of the Srebrenica enclave. Moreover, it is not unreasonable to note that the men could be separated from the women, children, and old people. Furthermore, the men taken prisoners could subsequently serve as a bargaining chip, as was frequently the case throughout the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. What was important at that time was to drive out all the Bosnian Muslims from the enclave, including the women, children, and old people. However, for reasons the trial chamber has been unable to clarify, the decision was then taken to kill all the men of fighting age. The result was inevitable. The destruction of the Bosnian Muslim population in Srebrenica. At issue is not only the commission of murders for political, racial, or religious reasons, which already constitutes a crime of persecution. At issue is not only extermination of the Bosnian Muslim men of fighting age alone. At issue is the deliberate decision to kill the men, a decision taken with complete awareness of the impact the murders would inevitably have on the entire group. By deciding to kill all the men of Srebrenica of fighting age, a decision was taken to make it impossible for the Bosnian Muslim people of Srebrenica to survive. Stated otherwise, what was ethnic cleansing became genocide. The trial chamber is also convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that a crime of genocide was committed in Srebrenica. Finally, for the reasons set forth in detail in its judgment, the trial chamber considers that the following crimes were committed: genocide, persecution, extermination, a murder within the meaning of Article 3 of the statute, murder within the meaning of Article 5, and the forced transfer of Bosnian Muslims. In light of the rules applicable to cumulative charging, only the crimes of genocide, persecution, and murder within the meaning of Article 3 of the statute have been retained by the trial chamber. We have now reached the response to the third question. Is General Krstić guilty of any of these crimes? The final question, which the trial chamber must answer, is whether General Krstić can be held guilty of these crimes. The prosecution claims that he can. The defense claims that he cannot. In order to establish the possible responsibility of General Krstić for these crimes, the trial chamber took account of his position as deputy commander and then commander of the Drina Corps at the time these crimes were committed. The Drina Corps, as I have already said, had authority over the entire area in which the crimes took place. For this reason, the trial chamber first reviewed what in the evidence presented by the parties would make it possible to establish whether or not the Drina Corps forces were involved in the crimes. This review allowed the trial chamber to conclude, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the Drina Corps forces participated in, if not all the crimes, at least some of them. However, it appeared also that other forces played a role, and sometimes a decisive one at that, in what happened, and in particular in the capture of the Bosnian Muslims and the executions. The judgment thus makes it clear that the following were involved in these crimes: the forces of the Ministry of the Interior, more commonly known as the MOOP, forces answering in principle to the main staff, and in particular, the 65th Motorized Protection Regiment, or the 10th Sabotage Detachment, of which Mr. Adamovich was a member, the military police forces, other armed forces, which probably included civilians or reservists who had taken up arms. However, the evidence also leads to the conclusion that all these forces acted in a coordinated manner and were organized for the same objective. The presence of General Mladic in Srebrenica and Potocari was mentioned on several occasions. At the time, General Mladic was the Chief of Staff of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Republika Srpska, that is, the number 2 man in the military hierarchy right below President Krstić. The trial chamber then sought to verify General Krstić's role at the time of the crimes, and in particular, any role he might have played in their commission. I will sketch out the positions taken by the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution claims that General Krstić was the deputy commander of the Drina Corps at the time the attack on Srebrenica was launched. As such, he was involved in the organization of the troops who took part in the attack. General Krstić assumed command of the Corps by the evening of 13 July 1995 at the latest. According to the prosecutor, he is thus responsible for all the crimes committed on the territory of the Drina Corps by virtue of Article 7.1 of the statute, that is, individually responsible. However, the prosecutor claims that General Krstić is also responsible as a commander by virtue of Article 7.3 of the statute. The defense contends that General Krstić was a professional officer, trained in the JNA, and was well aware of the rules applicable to armed conflicts. The defense never disputed that General Krstić was alongside General Mladic when the town of Srebrenica fell, that he was present at 2 of the 3 meetings at the Hotel Fontana, that General Krstić was successively the deputy commander and then the commander of the Drina Corps, a corps whose territorial jurisdiction covered all the territory on which the crimes occurred. The defense points out, however, that General Krstić in no manner committed any crime himself, and claims that he cannot be held responsible as a superior either. First, the attack on Srebrenica, in which he participated, was not unlawful as such. However, according to the defense, General Krstić became the commander of the Drina Corps only on 20 July 1995. and learned of the mass execution of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica only after that date. He had in fact been tasked by General Mladic to carry out the attack on Žepa on 13 July at the latest. The defense goes on to claim that General Krstić therefore had to change the position of his forward command post and thus found himself isolated in respect of the communications he was receiving. Lastly, the defense asserts that General Krstić had no involvement whatsoever in the digging up and the reburial of the bodies. The trial chamber has carefully reviewed all these arguments. The trial chamber has conducted a scrupulous examination of all the exhibits in the case file, as well as the testimony, whether of United Nations staff or victims. The trial chamber has meticulously weighed the information provided by the radio taps. In this respect, I recall that the trial chamber did not admit the recording in which a voice alleged to be that of General Krstić is heard saying, "Kill them all." I emphasize this point because it might have appeared that this exhibit was part of the case file, whereas that radio tap has not been admitted and is not an exhibit in the case file. However, the trial chamber did admit many other recordings, some of which are the subject of a detailed analysis in the judgment. Lastly, the trial chamber analyzed the reports of the military experts submitted both by the prosecution and the defense. And there is no possible doubt. When you entered Srebrenica with General Mladic on 11 July 1995, General Krstić, you found a deserted town. You thus knew that the population had fled. You were the deputy commander of the Junior Corps, and your commander, General Živanović, was there along with many other VRS officers. Assuming that you did not already know, you must have wondered where the population had gone. Because, according to your own statements, your objective was to separate Srebrenica from Žepa and to reduce the enclave to its urban area. It was therefore essential for you to know where at least the forces of the 28th decision might be, since they were not there. You were not at the first meeting in the Hotel Fontana in Bratunac on the evening of 11 July, around 2000 hours. But you were present at the second meeting. You say that you did not hear the scream of the pig being killed at that moment. But because you were sitting right next to General Mladic, you heard him speak in an arrogant and threatening voice, both to the Dutch-Bat commander and the representative of the Bosnian Muslim population of Srebrenica, who was there. You saw when General Mladic had the signboard which had been removed from the Srebrenica town hall, put on the table. You heard General Mladic asking the Bosnian Muslim armed forces to surrender, and the Dutch commander to organize the transfer of the women, children, and old people from Potocari. You were there, General Krstić, on 12 July at around 1000 hours, when General Mladic told the UNPROFOR officers that the forces of the DRS were going to organize the transfer, but that UNPROFOR would have to provide the necessary fuel. You heard General Mladic's tone of voice, even more menacing than the day before, when he spoke to the people who you knew were acting as representatives of the Bosnian Muslim community of Srebrenica. You gave orders for buses and other transport to come to Potocari quickly. You knew, at least by early morning on 12 July, that a large column of Bosnian Muslims was trying to cross the Bratunac-Konjević-Polje road. In any case, you knew that the column was moving north and therefore represented no danger for the rest of your operations in the other United Nations safe area, which you were preparing to attack. You were in Potocari, General Krstić, giving an interview when the first buses arrived. You were there when they began to separate the men from the women, the children, and the old people. You could not have seen their physical condition. You could not have heard the screams of the men who were taken to the building called the White House as they were being beaten. In accordance with the orders you received from General Mladic on the 13th of July, you focused on the preparations for the attack on Žepa. But you received information on a regular basis. You knew that when the buses arrived at the border of the area under Bosnian Muslim control, Drina Corps soldiers were making the men seeking refuge there get off. On 13 July in the evening, you knew that thousands of men from the column had been captured. On the evening of 13 July, and I repeat, the 13th of July, you took command of the Drina Corps and signed your first order as the Corps commander around 130 hours. On the 14th of July, you launched the attack on Žepa. Nonetheless, you remained perfectly well informed of what was going on in the area to the north of the town of Srebrenica. In the night of 14-15 July, troops from the Zvornik Brigade, one of the Drina Corps brigades, moved up from Žepa towards Srebrenica, and you knew why they were doing that. On the 15th of July in the morning, the security chief of the main staff called you and asked for your help in dealing with 3,500 packages. You knew exactly what was meant by packages, General Krstić. Bosnian Muslims who were to be executed. You expressed your displeasure. That same officer told you that the MOOP forces, the Interior Ministry Police, did not want, or no longer wanted, to do it. You said that you would see what you could do. On the 16th of July, some of your subordinates, men from the Bratunats Brigade, participated in the mass executions at the Branjevo military farm. On the 16th of July, the security chief of the Drina Corps, whose commander you were, continued to keep you informed about the situation. You asserted to the trial chamber that subsequently you wanted to take measures against that officer, but that out of fear of reprisals against yourself, or more specifically against your family, you decided not to. The trial chamber, however, found nothing to confirm your assertions. Not a single soldier of the Drina Corps was punished for the murder of one or several Bosnian Muslims. On the contrary, nothing makes it possible to establish that you participated in the activities designed to conceal the massacres, and to this end, in the operations of digging up and reburial of the corpses. But how could anybody think that you would not have known about work requiring the use of such large machines? In any case, General Krstić, you were seen being congratulated for the action you took in Srebrenica. You were seen right next to General Mladic when, in December 1995, a ceremony was organized for the Drina Corps. Finally, General Krstić, you supported General Mladic against President Krstić when he tried to remove General Mladic. General Krstić, can you stand or would you prefer to remain seated for medical reasons?
Si vous faites du mal, vous pouvez...
If you are in pain, you may remain seated, General. You may remain seated. Yes, remain seated. General Krstić, the trial chamber does not dispute that you are a professional soldier who loves his work. The trial chamber can accept that you would not of your own accord have taken the decision to execute thousands of civilians and disarmed persons. Someone else probably decided to order the execution of all the men of fighting age. The chamber is convinced of that. However, nonetheless, you are still guilty, General Krstić. You are guilty of having knowingly participated in the organized, forced transfer of the women, children, and old people in Srebrenica at the time of the attack on the 6th of July 1995 against the United Nations safe area. You are guilty of the murder of thousands of Bosnian Muslims between 10 and 19 July 1995, whether these be murders committed sporadically in Potocari or murders planned in the form of mass executions. You are guilty of the incredible suffering of the Bosnian Muslims, whether these be the ones in Potocari or survivors of the executions. You are guilty of the persecution suffered by the Bosnian Muslims of Srebrenica. Knowing that the women, children, and old people of Srebrenica had been transferred, you are guilty of having agreed to the plan to conduct mass executions of all the men of fighting age. You are therefore guilty of genocide, General Krstić. In order to determine the penalty which you deserve, we have, of course, taken into account the extreme gravity of the crime. Still, we also wish to show that in respect of the crimes committed on the territory of the former Yugoslavia, there are certainly people whose individual responsibility is much greater than your own. The Chamber wishes to recall the words of Kant, who said that if justice is ignored, life on this earth has no value. We believe that it is essential to make a distinction between what might be collective responsibility and individual responsibility. The tribunal has not been established to deal with the possibility of collective responsibility. What is of interest to us in each of the trials which we must hear in this court is to verify whether the evidence presented before us makes it possible to find an accused guilty. We seek to judge only accused who are individually responsible. We do not wish to judge a people. Yes, in the former Yugoslavia, there were attacks against civilian populations. Yes, there were massacres. There was persecution. Yes, some of these crimes were committed by Serbian forces. Still, to paraphrase the words of a great humanist, we consider that to associate this evil with Serbian identity would be an insult to the Serbian people and would betray the concept of civil society. It would be just as monstrous, however, not to attach any name to this evil, because that could be an offense to the Serbs. In July 1995, General Krstić individually you agreed to evil. And this is why today this trial chamber convicts you and sentences you to 46 years in prison. The court stands adjourned.
All rise. Vier